Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion, and here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 13th day of July. We're moving towards the middle of the month. This is a very unique month, a very interesting month. For those of us, and I consider myself one of these, those of us who get paid once a month because we're on Social Security or something, which is me, it's a tough month. Depending on when you do get paid. And because it just happens that my Social Security comes on the fourth Wednesday of each month. Well, this particular month, the fourth Wednesday comes almost at the end of the month because of the fact that the first of July was on Friday. I believe it was on Friday. Monday was the 4th, so it was on Friday. And so what that meant was that today is only the second Wednesday in July, even though we're halfway through it. So it requires a little better money management than I'm capable of doing. So I'm noticing the length of this month. But we are moving towards the middle of the month, and it's hard to believe that we're halfway through July in the year 2016 already. It's just crazy. It dawned on me this morning that it won't be that long before schools are opening up. I know, colleges begin in mid-August. And our schools public schools are usually about a week or 10 days after that. So, most of our public schools, K through 12 schools in this area start, within the last week or 10 days of the month of August. So, we're not that far away, and it's amazing. The summer's pretty much gone in that sense, but the weather has been perfect. We continue to have rain, more rain than I've ever seen. We're not getting here, at least where I am, we're not getting the traditional lull in cutting grass in the summertime. Usually things dry out in the summertime, and you get 4 or 5 weeks where it doesn't rain, so things don't grow. But this summer, it's not the case. We're getting rain 4 and 5 days a week. So it's been pretty hectic because you got to kind of stay on top of it all the time. It's a pleasure to be with you. This is our third day of live broadcasts this week, and I'm thrilled to be here. After today, of course, we won't be back together live again until next Monday. But I've thoroughly enjoyed some of the programs, a couple of the programs we've had this week. And when I say I enjoyed them, I do that with obviously quotation marks or around it, because obviously what set a bunch of this off, of course, was the violence and the killing of innocent blacks and the slaughter of 5 Dallas policemen that followed it. And many of you, I'm sure, have taken the opportunity or saw it live yesterday, President Obama's comments at the memorial service for the 5 Dallas policemen. And once again, President Obama can deliver a speech that's just spellbinding. I had 3 or 4 different people tell me yesterday what an incredible speech it was, and how much they're going to miss President Obama, even if they don't like his politics. It's just the class. There's an element of class and sophistication in the way he delivers a message that's very, very important, I think. And I'm kind of excited, to be honest with you, that as many people appreciate that. I have, and I find his comments and the way he delivers his materials. And obviously, we know he doesn't write all of these, but he proofs them and approves them and corrects them, edits them, and all of that. But he has speech writers, and obviously, what he's looking for in his speech writers is a pretty unique style of presentation, and he's getting it because the presentation at the memorial service yesterday was just astounding. The message was so solid, and he made the point that this is like his 13th memorial service in the 8 years that he's been in office. So it's, I guess one could say, to be a little bit sarcastic about it, that he's had a lot of practice, unfortunately. So we've been, that's been kind of the instigator for our programs this week. But we spent quite a bit of time looking at Thomas Jefferson, at the writings of Thomas Jefferson. We spent some time with Emerson in Emerson's essay on the Oversoul, which I just find thrilling. I've got to tell you, as many times as I've read it, I just find it thrilling. And today I've kind of, I guess I'm on a Jefferson kick a little bit, but I mentioned the exchange of letters between Jefferson and John Adams that begins during Madison's administration, pretty much during the War of 1812. The battles that Jefferson and Adams had in the late 90s pretty much estranged them. They stopped speaking to each other for a number of years, and they really don't pick up again until Madison is in his second term, which is 1812 to 1816, and that's, of course, when the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain breaks out, and England breaks out, and it's at that point that Jefferson and John Adams reestablished their links, reestablished their communications, and by this time they both acknowledged that they're in their later years, and they're kind of looking back over their lives, and they're reacting to things, and they're offering their opinions on things. And the fact of the matter is, because they are private, I mean, it's a letter one man to another, because they are private, what you find in these letters is that there's an awful lot of rich, interesting information in them, things that they wouldn't say if these things were public. It's kind of like today with emails, and especially with Twitter, because people are so captivated, if you will, using Twitter. The instantaneous communication is so infectious that what we're finding is people tend to put things in Twitter and send them before they really think about what indeed they're saying, and sometimes they wish they could take back the send. And Jefferson and Adams didn't worry about this. These were letters sent the old-fashioned way. Talk about snail mail. It was really snail mail then. And the letters are long, and they're rich, and they're substantive, and I just find them absolutely magical. And I've got one today. To tell you the truth, I was reading a secondary source, and I was looking principally at Jefferson's ideas on education, and I'll get into in a moment why I was doing that. But I was looking at sources related to Jefferson's views on education. And in this particular source, I found reference to a letter, Jefferson to Adams, written in 1814, the 5th of July, the day after the 4th of July in the year 1815. And there was a passage in there about education, and the author quoted several portions of that letter, and I thought, I've got to get my hands on that letter. So I spent quite a bit of time this morning, and I got the letter, and it's absolutely incredible. And I've spent an hour this morning, when I should have been preparing for the program, on that letter, to the point that I've decided that I really think that a good portion of today's program will be based on that letter. And I'm doing this with a little bit of trepidation, a little bit of doubt, and a little bit of uncertainty, because it's not necessarily the kind of thing that we generally deal with here. It's not powerful stuff, if that makes sense. In one sense, in other words, those that are looking for political analysis and all of that are not going to find it in this letter. But what you are going to find, and what I found in this letter, is the excitement of finding it. The excitement of actually noting what's in it, because I think some of the things in it will surprise you. They did me. And it just, to me, has been a classic example of how exciting learning can be. And I'm gambling here because I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to communicate that excitement to you here on today's program at the Virtual Center. So I really do encourage you to hang in there with me. I hope that you'll enjoy it. If you do, and if you get out of it some of the things that I hope you will get out of it, I think you'll find today's program one that you'll particularly remember, because to me, it kind of reinforces my faith in mankind, if that makes sense. Plus the fact I just absolutely am in love with the way that Jefferson writes. His style is just incredible. And John Adams doesn't write nearly as well as Jefferson, I don't believe. But on the other hand, John Adams is incredibly bright, incredibly well educated and well read. And he wallows around in the issues, the same kinds of issues that Jefferson does. And at one point in this letter, Jefferson makes the point that I hope I'm not going too far in laying all this stuff on you. But the reason I'm doing it is because you're familiar with some of this stuff. In other words, what I have in you is a common soul, is what he's saying to John Adams. And he said, I don't find people that often that I can share this stuff with because it's news to them. It's like, and he uses this expression, he said, it's almost like it just dropped from the moon. But I know that you'll know where I'm coming from and what I'm going to say, and you'll be able to react to it and appreciate it. And that's why I'm laying all this on you. And I just thought it was just so human and so sensitive. And how many people today are sensitive enough to introduce something they want to say with that kind of justification, almost apology ahead of time? So that's kind of where I think we'll be going today. I do invite you to participate. We've had a couple of days of programming this week. We spent quite a bit of time with Jefferson. We spent quite a bit of time on the violence and the racial issues in America. We looked at the George Will piece from last week's Washington Post that alluded to and made reference to both the Coleman report and the point of the report on the black family in America that was authored by Patrick Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, 1 year after the Coleman report was issued, on education of black youngsters in America. And, of course, George Will makes quite a bit out of both of those, because both of those indicate something that is very, very close to George Will's heart, and that is that these problems go much deeper than problems you can solve by throwing money at them. These go right into the very nature of the black community in America itself. And, of course, the danger of that, and I think we pointed this out in the last couple of days, the danger of that is that we end up oftentimes, not necessarily intentionally, I'm not suggesting that George Will does this intentionally, but it's very easy to slide into the idea of blaming the victim. That in a sense, once you make the case and once you draw from the Coleman report and the Moynihan report and you focus on some of the data, some of the statistics there, then what you are ending up is saying there's so many problems inherent in the black community in America that it's really unfair to say that the reason black youngsters are having such a difficult time in education is because we are discriminating against them in the way we fund our schools. And of course, what they're doing is addressing that issue of the problems of our inner city schools, not by saying we need to find a way to make sure that the resources that we put into education for these children are equal to the resources we put into the education of other children in our nation. One would think they would go that way, but no. The alternative is you basically point out that there are so many problems within the black community that education itself can't do it. And so in a sense, what you're doing is justifying the discriminatory misallocation of funds to certain groups of people. I find that very, very disturbing. And I'm not saying that George Will is intentionally doing that. He's blaming the victim in order to rationalize or justify discriminatory behavior in the way that money is allocated. I'm not going to accuse that of being intentional. But the fact of the matter is that's what we've got. And that's what these reports do. And I think it's very important to recognize that. Because as long as you are looking for ways to shield you, and I use you in the much more general, broad sense, global sense, all of us, as long as we continue to look for ways to not accept responsibility for what we are doing, then we can't really solve the problems. And we can't really relate to the reaction that we get from Black America. And I think we're seeing it. We're seeing it in the Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing it in a number of other things. There is this basic reality within Black America. And I don't think we can any longer deny that it's there. That discrimination is long and deep. And that there are still too many people in this country that will not own up to it, but rather continue to try to find ways to shift the responsibility from themselves to the victim. And as long as that happens, the problems are not going to be solved. And until we are willing to acknowledge that, we're not even going to be able to begin the process of resolving some of these problems. So that's where we've been this week. And I know that those of you who've been listening have reactions to this. This stuff is so powerful and so sensitive that I can't imagine that anybody would listen to it for any length of time and not have opinions or reactions to some of it. So I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas on these issues with others who are equally concerned about these issues. And fortunately, as you know, many of these others, the most interested, the most concerned, and the brightest others are regular listeners here at the Head On Radio Network, and some of them, obviously, to our program here at the Virtual Center. What I'm saying is, if you do take it upon yourself to share your thoughts on the air, you can be sure that you're doing it with people who have thought as deeply as you have and who will respect and give the proper credibility and credence to what you have to say. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts in an email with me, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. WAObrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, no punctuation, at gmail.com. And once again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. And if you go to the search box on the home page at Facebook and just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to the Virtual Center Facebook page. And on it, there are a number of postings. And I continue to get reactions from people to some of these postings, and I invite you to do the same. You can react in the comment opportunities that Facebook makes available to us, or you can pick up the phone and call our number at 304-663-4676, or you can drop me an email, waobrien906@gmail.com. Point is, we would love to hear from you. We would love the opportunity to have that kind of an exchange on some of these issues. My goal, my job here, what I think I'm supposed to be doing, at least this is what I set out to do, is to raise the questions which will spur reaction. And so I do encourage you to react. And I want you to know that it will be welcomed when and if you do. So with that, I'd like to get into a little bit of substance in today's program. I shared a link on Facebook this morning. I didn't put it on our Facebook, on the Virtual Center Facebook page. I put it on my personal Facebook page. So the only ones that would be getting it would obviously be those that are listed on that Facebook page as friends. But it relates, it's a link to an article that by Tom Friedman that appeared in today's New York Times. And it's on the Republican Party. It's on the impact that this particular election, more particularly the candidacy of Donald Trump, is having on the Republican Party. And the reason that I reacted on Facebook to this particular piece and put the link on it is because I think it's an important article for a couple of reasons. Obviously, because of what's in it. But secondarily, because it's Thomas Friedman. I know a lot of people don't like Thomas Friedman for a lot of reasons. He tends to be the classic establishmentarian in a lot of ways. He's obviously done very well. He's very reputable. He's very well off financially. And a lot of people believe that that he has really tended to become a little bit insensitive to some of the issues and some of the people that helped get him where he is. And I can understand that. I mean, I don't necessarily buy into it, but I can understand it. The fact remains, however, that Tom Friedman is one of the best op-ed people, one of the more thoughtful commentators we have in our society. Yesterday I mentioned, and we looked at a piece written by George Will. And George Will has been for a long time a prize-winning spokesman for the right in this country. And again, some people would say, on a network like the Head On Radio Network, the last thing we want to hear is anything that George Will might have to say. But the reality is the reason George Will has been around as long as he has and has become as successful as he has is because he's got something to say. He's bright. He's thoughtful. He's insightful. Therefore, he's worth reading. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree with him to read him. That's a point that we keep coming back to over and over and over again. I think it's important that we do everything we can do to resist this inclination all of us have, not just a few of us, but everybody has, and that is to read and subscribe to points of view that are close to our own. We feel comfortable there because the people who are speaking to us most likely agree with us. But the fact of the matter is, by definition, that limits our opportunities to learn anything. And so in a sense, there's quite a bit to be learned by looking at those and listening to those who don't necessarily agree with us. And in the case of George Will, for example, the information and the substance contained in many of his pieces is information worth knowing. The fact that George Will gives it to us is immaterial, as long as we recognize that since it comes from George Will, it's going to come with a particular spin or a particular interpretation on it. But we're sharp enough, theoretically, hopefully, to spot that. The same thing is true with Thomas Friedman. I don't think Thomas Friedman goes into the same category as George Will in terms of philosophy, in terms of position on issues. I think Thomas Friedman would be much more considered a liberal than would George Will. But the fact of the matter is, and I think I made reference to him a few moments ago, as establishment columnist. And what that means is he's liberal, but he's liberal in a way which a lot of people are uncomfortable with. That's the debate that we've had between those people supporting Bernie Sanders and whether, in fact, they can move smoothly over to support Hillary Clinton. Because Hillary Clinton is so associated with the establishment, that's going to be difficult for some people, and we know that. We've talked about that. So it's the same thing with Thomas Friedman. The point is that Thomas Friedman made a statement, his article today, basically is pretty definitive. And what I mean by that is he's not waffling at all. He's making it very clear where he stands. And one of the reasons that some people don't like Thomas Friedman often is because they feel that he does waffle. He tries to walk both sides of the fence at the same time. He's a liberal in the classic sense. He wants to be seen as progressive, but at the same time, he's so connected to the establishment that he can only be so progressive. He's only willing to go out there so far. And a lot of us, and understandably, a lot of people resent that, and I can understand that. He makes the statement this morning in his piece that for the best interests of the nation, he hopes that the November election will be a landslide victory for Hillary Clinton. He hopes that Democrats will not only win the White House, but that they'll win the governorships that are up, that they'll win back control of the Senate, and that they'll even go so far as to win control of the House. And the reason for that is, he says, that one of the worst things you can have is one-party government in a democracy. The whole nature of our system is based on the idea that there are viable parties, that there are viable alternative positions on issues. People who disagree come together and look for ways to compromise. That's the way our system is built to work. I don't think any of us would question that. His point is that when one of those two parties, one of those major parties, is not interested in solving problems, is not interested in seeing government govern, but rather is driven by only one goal, and that is to obstruct, to keep government from doing anything, then that is deadly in a democratic system, because it basically means that government can't do anything that screams out for action. Major things that need to be done, government can't do. I think we could spend a lot of time citing examples to that. But let me cite the one that's most obvious, and it's going on right now, is funding for the Zika outbreak, or the potential Zika outbreak. This is the period, moving towards the end of the period, when spraying for mosquitoes that might be carrying that virus is most critical. And yet Congress has been unable to come up with legislation that would provide the funding necessary to take substantive action on combating the Zika virus. So there's a distinct possibility that we could be confronted with a fairly substantial outbreak of a horrendous disease. And it's not like we didn't have plenty of warning that it was coming, but our political system found itself incapable or unwilling to address it. That's what Friedman's talking about. And his argument is that a government can go on and can sustain that for a while, a couple of years, but not indefinitely. And we've been engaged in exactly that, government obstructionism, for the last several years under President Obama. And Friedman says that it's time to break it. And the thing that'll break it more than anything else is a total landslide. Not only must the Democrats win, but they must win big enough to break the roadblock in legislation. And Friedman says he hopes that that's what happens for the benefit of the nation. Caught my eye because Friedman is usually not that definitive on issues. He's not usually that willing to go out on the edge of on a limb or go out on the edge of a plank and take a position that's quite that definitive. But in this case, he does that. There are two other things in this article that I believe make the article worthy of a read. I think it's an important one that all of us should read. The first one is that Friedman lays out a prospective, progressive agenda if indeed that landslide he hopes will happen does indeed happen. He talks about if Democrats control House, Senate, court, state governments, state legislatures, etc., if the ability to obstruct is taken away, then that means that government can do some things that it's been unable to do before. And Friedman lays out a number of examples. Common sense gun laws. Going to work on the infrastructure. Creating meaningful, well-paying jobs that would stimulate growth and at the same time repair our crumbling infrastructure in roads, bridges, airports, rails, and inadequate bandwidth, which makes the use of technology in economic development difficult. All of these things would be possible with a sweeping Clinton victory, he says. Also, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, which would stimulate clean energy production and make it possible not only to reduce corporate taxes, but to reduce personal income taxes as well. Make needed corrections in Obamacare. Up to this point, the Republican Party has pretty much been driven by the desire to abolish Obamacare totally. Friedman's point is there are things wrong with it, but in order to fix those things, you got to have somebody that doesn't want to destroy the whole system, especially when you don't have an alternative. And that's what we've been dealing with in the last 5 or 6 years during the debates over Obamacare. Those people that are determined to destroy Obamacare don't have a meaningful alternative or a meaningful substitute. So in other words, there's some real specific legislation possibilities laid out in this article. In that sense, it's informative, it seems to me. There's something else in this article that is informative, and it's all contained in one particular paragraph, and I wanted to share that paragraph with you. And that basically says that a sweeping Clinton victory in November would send the message that never again will the nation allow itself to be captured by anyone else able to do what Donald Trump has done. That Donald Trump has really taken advantage of vulnerabilities and weaknesses in our political system that has propelled him all the way to candidacy for the President of the United States. And if the voters send a clear message that this will no longer be tolerated, then Friedman feels that the risks of a sweeping victory would be worth it. He said, at the same time, if Clinton crushes Trump in November, the message will be sent by the American people that the game he played to become the Republican nominee through mainstreaming bigotry, name-calling, insulting women, the handicapped, Latinos, Muslims, retweeting posts by hate groups, ignorance of the Constitution, a willingness to lie and to make stuff up with ease and regularity never seen before at the presidential campaign level. These things the American people would be saying will never again be tolerated. Friedman believes that the importance of that message is such that it's worth the risk, the dangers, and there are dangers in a sweeping victory of one party over the other. And then finally, he believes that another advantage of this particular of a Democratic sweep would be it would really force the Republican Party to take a couple of steps back and regroup and really agree once and for all that there is a meaningful, substantive, conservative alternative to addressing many of the world's problems today. And the Republican Party has allowed itself to lose sight of that message, to lose sight of that very important perspective, which the two parties coming together would be able to use as the basis for negotiation and compromise. It would force the GOP, Friedman says, to go back to the drawing board and really begin to redefine what it means to be a conservative Republican. Friedman is accepting the idea that that alternative is important in a political system such as ours, and we've lost it. And the only thing that's going to cause the Republican leadership to do that, Friedman feels, is a stunning defeat. And so that's one more advantage that Friedman sees from this. I think that particular message is one that all of us need to at least think about and to reflect upon for a moment. We're in the midst of a thunderstorm here. I'm hoping it doesn't do any damage to our internet connection, but we'll just kind of go on as if there's not a problem. So that's really the issue. I think some of the things that Donald Trump has been guilty of during the primaries has been able to get away with, and not pay a penalty for, which I think is important, I think those are quite significant things, and I really believe that Friedman is right on in some of those. With that, I want to share with you. This is copy. This is a quote, and I want to share it with you. And it deals with the idea of a prominent leader who in many ways is very successful and to be admired. And I think all of us could agree that would be Donald Trump. I mean, in the world of business, given what he's been able to do, while many of us aren't necessarily all that comfortable with some of the strategies and tactics that he's used, the fact of the matter is it's a little bit difficult to deny that Donald Trump has really learned how to play the game and has played it well. And here's the quote. But he was a lion in the field only. In civil life, a cold-blooded, calculating, unprincipled usurper. Without virtue, no statesman, knowing nothing of commerce, political economy, or civil government, and supplying ignorance by bold presumption. I had supposed him a great man until a certain point. And once we reached that point, from that date, I set him down as a scoundrel. To the wonders of his rise and fall, we may add respect and at the same time distress. The point I'm making here is that particular quote seems to fit very logically into what we were talking about a moment ago about Tom Friedman's article on Donald Trump. But let me tell you where the quote came from. It's from a letter by Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, written on the 5th of July, 1814. And the person that Jefferson is talking about is not Donald Trump. It's Napoleon Bonaparte. And, when you think about this, it kind of hits home as to how some of this stuff comes around again and how insightful this can be. That quote comes from the letter that I was referring to during our at the very beginning of today's program. We're talking about the exchange of letters between Jefferson and John Adams. This particular one is dated July 5th, 1814. It's during the War of 1812. It's before the Treaty of Ghent that ends that war in 1815. And it's an exchange between two individuals, both of whom realize that they are in their waning years. Let me read a couple of the opening sentences of this, because I mentioned that one of the things I really love about these letters is the style, how well they're written. Let me share this with you. Jefferson says to John Adams, "Dear Sir, since mine of January 24th, my letter of January 24th, yours of March 14th was received." In other words, since I sent you my letter in January, I have received yours in mid-March. It was not acknowledged in the short one of May 18th by Mr. Reeves, The only object have that having been to enable one of our most promising young men to have the advantage of making his bow to you. I learned with great regret the serious illness mentioned in your letter. John Adams had made it clear that he had lost a daughter in his March letter to Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is only now in July responding to that loss. Mr. Reeves is obviously the go-between. He's bringing the letter. He said, I learned with great regret the serious illness mentioned in your letter, and I hope Mr. Reeves will be able to tell me you are entirely restored. And then Jefferson makes a comment that I just love, and I wanted to share with you. He says to Adams, but our machines have now been running for 70 or 80 years. And we must expect that, worn as they are, here a pivot, there a wheel, now a pinion, next a spring, will be giving way. And however we may tinker them up for a while, all will at length cease motion. In other words, old friend, we're getting old and we're going to die. Both of our machines have been running for a long time. And if it hasn't started yet, then we know that one thing after the other is going to start breaking down. And the one thing that Jefferson didn't have that we have today is prescription drugs. And how many people, and I do this because I'm there, I talk to friends all the time who are in the same position I am, who are on the same medications, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, monitoring their blood count, their glucose count, monitoring their blood pressure, taking blood pressure medication, and this medication and that medication. I know I had a conversation with a member of my own family who was making the point. It seems like when you get a prescription for one thing, it causes something else, then you need another prescription. And what you end up with is a line of prescription drug bottles that covers the shelf from one end to the other. I know exactly what he's talking about because I think I have the same thing, and I think other people do as well. And here's Jefferson expressing that to John Adams. I just find that so sensitive and so encouraging to be able to say that our machines have been running for 70 or 80 years, my friend, and we have to expect, worn as they are, that here a pivot, there a wheel, now a pinion, next a spring will be giving way, and however we may tinker them up for a while, all will at length cease motion. And then he says this, and I love it. Our watches, with works of brass and steel, wear out within that period. Shall you and I last to see the course the sevenfold wonders of the time will take? In other words, as we look at the world, I think we have to realize that we're not going to be around to see how all of this ends. And how many times have you heard senior citizens make the comment? I've heard it numerous times. I wish I could live for another 30 years to see how this all comes out. You can say that when you're 30 and 40, but you can't when you're 60 and 70. And, of course, the reality is when you're 30 or 40, you don't think to say it because you haven't yet reached the point where you begin to appreciate what you are seeing that at some point in time you're not going to be able to see anymore. And then Jefferson, in this letter, deals with three topics. And the topic that led me to the letter, as I mentioned in our introduction today, was education. Were some of the things that Jefferson says about education. That's what led me to this letter. And when I read a few of the quotations from a secondary source taken from this letter, my reaction was, I got to see the letter. And when I found the entire letter, I realized that it was long enough and rich enough that it was really worth our time here at the Virtual Center. I gambled. I'm hoping that you'll agree with me. Let me share with you, and I know that this is a course on the this is a program devoted to the idea of the constitutional system of the United States, the nature of our republic. But I think one of the issues that our republic constantly must deal with is foreign policy. And I think that when one of our founders is talking about foreign policy and how he sizes up leaders around the world, it can be quite informative. So I wanted to share with you some of the things that Jefferson says about Napoleon Bonaparte. And there's a historical reason why I think this is important. In our textbooks, in our nation, there are very few people, I would bet, there are very few people who know that Jefferson had negative things to say about Napoleon or about the things that were happening in France during the late 18th century at the time of and immediately after the so-called French Revolution, which broke out in 1789. In our textbooks, in our own history, we know that the French Revolution and the resumption of war with England, between England and France, that followed the French Revolution, we know that this particular foreign policy issue played a dramatic role in the emergence of party politics in America. Because the Hamiltonian Federalists lined up 100% behind England. Because Hamilton and the middle-class business interests that he represented believed that America's future was best protected by maintaining a good relationship with England because of the commercial possibilities. We needed England. We needed trade, not only with England as a nation, but with the empire. Because the English empire literally was spread around the world. To take a position and support France and therefore be excluded from the commercial privileges of the British Empire would sink our economy. And Hamilton knew it. So therefore, when the war between England and France resumed in the 1790s, in the early 1790s, Hamilton and the Federalists who followed him were 100% behind England. Therefore, they made it very clear, and Hamilton put pressure on Washington to not honor the alliance, the Treaty of Alliance, that we had with France from 1778. In that treaty, in that alliance, we had committed ourselves, in case of war between England and France, that we would support France. So obviously, this played a direct role in our history. We also know that as strong as Federalists, as Hamilton and the Federalists supported England, so also Jefferson and the Republican opposition emerging in Congress supported France. They believed that we had treaty obligations to support the French. They recognized that if it hadn't been for France's support, we never would have won independence from England anyway. And so they believed that the honor of the nation demanded that we honor our treaty obligations and support the French. Plus, as we know, those people that were Republican who were supporting Jefferson and Madison and who were involved in the emergence of the Republican opposition supported France primarily because the people they hated most, the merchants, the bankers, the financiers, the insurance interests, etc., were supporting England. In other words, the best reason to not support England is because you hate the people who are. So the result was, and history tells us this, that Jefferson and the Republicans lined up with France. And that tension between Federalists and Republicans, driven further and further apart by the war between England and France in the 1790s, really dictates the politics of the 1790s in America. The coalescing of two distinct political parties, and finally culminates in the election of Jefferson in the election of 1800. John Adams, of course, becomes a victim of this, because when Washington decides that he's not going to run for a third term in 1796, and instead releases his farewell address and warns the nation about parties, because there they are, Adams becomes president. And so during this whole mess from 1796-97 up till 1800, Adams is president. And because of the hostility between him and Jefferson, that's why they don't speak for another decade after that. It's not until after 1812 that they resume communication between each other. That's what our textbook tells us, and it's accurate. So from that, we draw the logical conclusion that Jefferson always was a supporter of France. And that would mean that he supported the French Revolution. He supported what he called the People's Revolution. And likely that he supported Napoleon as well. So most people don't know that Jefferson ever turned on Napoleon. It came late, but once he saw it, he really turned around. And this letter reveals that. So to John Adams, Jefferson is saying, I had supposed Napoleon to be a great man until his entrance into the assembly prior to the time that he took over as head of the government of France. From that date, however, and this is Jefferson speaking, from that date, however, I set him down as a great scoundrel only. To the wonders of his rise and fall, we may add that of a Tsar of Muscovy dictating in Paris laws and limits to all the successors of the Caesars, and holding even the balance in which the fortunes of this new world are suspended. I own that while I rejoice for the good of mankind, to the deliverance of Europe from the havoc which would have never ceased while Bonaparte should have the merit while Bonaparte should have lived in power. I see with anxiety the tyrant of the ocean remaining in vigor and even participating in the merit of crushing his brother tyrant. In other words, even in the crushing of Napoleon, I see dangers in the Russian Tsar, who is using this opportunity to build up his own credits if you will, to enhance his own influence and power in the world. And then Jefferson goes on and says, while the world is thus turned upside down, on which side of it are we? And then he starts talking about the pros and the cons of continuing to support France or supporting England. And he talks about the fisheries and raises questions to John Adams about how Massachusetts would stand on this. And basically what Jefferson is saying is we're Southerners and Westerners. We could care less about the New England fisheries. But we also realize that New England, Massachusetts, has to take them very seriously. So he basically concludes that Napoleon is a scoundrel and that his dying years on a small island in the Mediterranean is good enough for him. I don't think many people realize that Jefferson even took that position. There are two other issues in this letter, and after we take our break, we'll come back and we'll deal with those two issues. They are connected. One of the issues is education. The second one is Jefferson on Plato. And I think one of the things we're going to see is that the things that Jefferson has to say about Plato tie in directly into things Jefferson believes about education. And I think it's informative for all of us. So I'd like to take the opportunity in today's program, in our second hour, to flesh out those particular issues. We've just gone to the top of the hour. It's 1 minute after the top of the hour. So we're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a short 5-minute pause, we'll be back and we'll continue our second hour. So I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you.
And we now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 13th day of July in the year 2016, and if you are just joining us, welcome. If you have been with us, I thank you for staying with us. We're into a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, dated the 5th of July in 1814. And we spent our first hour kind of setting the background, the historical context of that particular exchange. We talked a little bit about the history of Jefferson and John Adams, and as a result of the hostilities born in the late 90s, political hostilities, Jefferson and Adams for many years did not communicate at all. And they really didn't reestablish communication until after 1812. So beginning in 1813, 1814, and thereafter, we have this incredible exchange between Jefferson and John Adams. The letters are so rich. I hadn't thought of this before. Something just occurred to me, and I'll share it with you because I think it might make the point that I was trying to make even more clearly. I have said many times on this program, and I think if you've been a regular listener and you go back a couple of years, you'll remember and recall whereof I speak. I mentioned that when we're talking about the origins of the Constitution and why it's structured as it is and what Madison's thinking was on particular issues that led to the drafting of the Constitution in the format that he did, I have made the comment that there's more information in the exchange between Jefferson and Madison in 1787 prior to the Constitutional Convention, but from late 86 through 87, and the Constitutional Convention begins in May of 1787. And while it's going on, the numbers of letters between Jefferson and Madison are much less for obvious reasons. Madison is occupied. And remember, all of this time, Jefferson is in France. But there are a couple of letters written through the summer that the convention is meeting. And then when the convention adjourns in September, on the 17th of September, 1787, Madison takes up pen and begins to reestablish close communications with Jefferson and begins to bounce certain aspects of the Constitution off Jefferson in order to get his response. And I've made the point that that exchange from late 86 through late 87 between Madison and Jefferson is probably as rich on really what the Constitution is all about as one could find anywhere. Well, now I'm beginning to appreciate that after their political careers are over, after they retired from active political life, the Adams-Jefferson communications are as rich as you're going to find anywhere. Because you've got two bright men who lived through it all, who reestablished communication and are kind of reliving, going back through the issues and the events of the previous half century when they were so politically active in the establishment and the founding of this republic. I really think these letters are rich. In this July 5th letter, besides the introduction which we looked at, where Jefferson tells Adams, you know, we're both getting old, we're both in our 70s and 80s, the engines are beginning to run slow, and we both know that one thing after the other begins to go, the pinions, the springs, or whatever, and we can tinker with them here and there, but we know that it's not going to be too long before the old machine just shuts down and stops working. And it's just so insightful and so true. And then, as we looked, the first issue that Jefferson deals with is foreign policy, more particularly on Napoleon Bonaparte. And Jefferson really unloads to Adams. Doesn't unload on Adams, but he unloads to Adams about his disappointment and disillusionment with Napoleon, and how he had been a big supporter up until a certain point in the 1790s. And then he began to recognize that Napoleon was a fraud more than anything else, and his whole position changed. And as I mentioned, I don't think a lot of people know that Jefferson ever made that statement or ever took that kind of a stand against Napoleon, because in our history books, he's always gone down as pro-France, pro-France, pro-France all the way through, anti-England, anti-England. I don't think that people would expect. I didn't. When I found this letter and I saw that about Napoleon, I thought, oh, I've got to share this. This is just great. So if you have a reaction, we'd love to hear it. We'd love to hear it. We have a phone number, and it gives you the opportunity to get on the air and share your thoughts and your ideas with other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts that way, I would thoroughly enjoy hearing from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I mentioned our Facebook page. If you go to the search box and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings there. And I assure you that there, in the next couple of days, there's going to be a few more, because I'm going to take some of this Jefferson stuff and load it up on Facebook, because I believe that other people would relish knowing some of this stuff. And for those of you listening who would like a copy of this, I think you'll be able to get some of it off Facebook if you can just give me a day or two to get it up there. So with that, I'd like to go back to the Jefferson letter. And the second issue that Jefferson deals with in some detail is Plato. And the third issue is education. And Jefferson is very critical of education at the time, and very, very much a supporter of the need for educational reform. What attracts me and what I'd like to share with you here in this second hour of our program today is what about education Jefferson believes needs reforming. I think it's very telling and very real, and I think most of us will be able to relate to it. And the second thing, and actually I'm going to deal with this first because it comes first in the letter, is Jefferson's reaction to Plato. And I believe that what he's going to be saying about education is tied directly into what he says about Plato, and we'll make that. I hope I can make that point as we go forth. So that's what we're looking at as our second hour. And I do encourage you to stay with us. Right now we're at 16 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 45 minutes left in our program. So with that, I want to share with you some of the things that Jefferson says about Plato. So let me go back to the letter and share with you the context of the background. Jefferson says, after he gets through with world affairs and after he gets through saying what he needs to say about Napoleon and about the wars in Europe and about the issue of the New England fisheries, in other words, he's obviously right in John Adams's wheelhouse there, because as we know, John Adams comes from and is in Massachusetts. Then he gets into his reading habits. And this is where Plato is going to come in. He says, I'm just returned from one of my long absences, having been at my other home for 5 weeks past. Having more leisure there than here for reading, I amused myself with reading seriously Plato's Republic. I am wrong, however, in calling it amusement, for it was the heaviest task work I ever went through. I underline that because I've heard students say that all the years that I was teaching. What they will say is that the toughest reading they ever had to do was Plato. I think they would find it encouraging to hear Thomas Jefferson say the same thing. You can't call it amusement, he says, for it's just about the heaviest work that I ever went through. And he goes on. I had occasionally before taken up some of his other works, but scarcely ever had patience to go through a whole dialogue. Many of you who have taken philosophy in college know about the dialogues in Plato. Our assumption is that educated people have read them and that we're deficient because we haven't. And when we are assigned to read them, many people naturally go to Cliff's Notes or something like that, outlines or summaries of the different dialogues in the different books of the Republic. Here's Jefferson in his old age, in July of 1814, admitting that this is the first time he's been able to sit down and read a complete dialogue. So if you're like me, you're saying, geez, I always thought that Jefferson had read them all. I thought that Adams and the rest of them, because they talk about them as if they read them. This is why I wanted to raise this today. So what's the answer? The reality is that these guys have been name dropping. They've read excerpts. They've seen quotes. And they use the quotes as if they, in fact, extracted these quotes from the original. I read the original, and I pulled out these particular quotations or these particular paragraphs. The fact of the matter is, they got them from somewhere else. I mentioned already today that I was reading a secondary source about Jefferson's philosophy of education and saw a reference to this July 5th letter from Jefferson to Adams. And it so intrigued me, I said, I got to read that letter. And when I got to it, I realized that there's all of this stuff in it about Napoleon Bonaparte and about Plato, in addition to what I was after about education. By reading this, I get a much deeper appreciation of Jefferson and where Jefferson's mind is and what he's thinking and why he thinks that way. And I find it invigorating to know that Jefferson is an old man before he can admit to John Adams that he finally took 5 weeks away and read Plato from beginning to end, or read the dialogue from beginning to end. He never was able to do it before. Because none of us can do that either. And we feel deficient about it. We feel that it must be us. That's why we think these guys must have been so much better educated than we are, because I can't read this stuff. But they did. But now we're finding out that they really didn't. They name dropped. They did the same kind of things that we do today. They subscribed to certain magazines and certain journals, and they lay them around the house. They lay them on the coffee table and in the bathroom, so that when they have guests, people look around and say, geez, look at the stuff this guy reads. He must really be smart. He must be well educated. He must be. And it's all a cover. It's all for show. And Jefferson, in effect, is admitting in this letter to John Adams that it has been for him too. Now, that doesn't mean he's not well read. I'm not suggesting that Thomas Jefferson is a phony. On the contrary. But the fact of the matter is, he went to college and he majored in moral philosophy, and he read Adam Smith and many of these things. But you can't read them all from cover to cover. For example, I took high school Latin, and beginning in our 3rd year, we read Caesar's Wars, Caesar's Gallic campaigns, in the original Latin. But hell, we didn't finish them. Our goal was to translate the Latin into English and to become proficient at it. So we would be assigned for homework each night 20, 25 lines to translate. And we would translate 25 lines, and then the next night we'd translate the next 25 lines. Our goal was the translation. It was not understanding Julius Caesar, what Julius Caesar had written. And then the next year, when we took Latin, in our 4th year, we read Virgil in the original. that doesn't mean that I've read Virgil in the original. It means that years ago, I could sit down and translate with quite a bit of difficulty. I could translate Latin into English. But I learned enough to appreciate the value and the beauty of the language and the structure. And because English is derived directly from Latin roots, this background in Latin has given me an advantage in writing English, because I have gained the opportunity to understand the structure of sentences and paragraphs and all of that, probably more than I would have if I didn't have that opportunity. So I think all of this stuff is kind of important, and I hope you agree. I took a gamble, I took a chance that you would agree with me that this is this is pretty neat stuff. So anyway, Jefferson is talking about Plato, and he said that up until now, he scarcely ever had patience to go through a whole dialogue. Now he's done it. While wading through the whimsies, I find this really, really interesting. While wading through the whimsies, the puerilities, and unintelligible jargon of this work, I laid it down often to ask myself how it could have been said that the world should have so long consented to give reputation to such nonsense as this. How many people have been forced to read Plato and have said, this is gobbledygook? This doesn't say it. Who the hell can understand this stuff? Here's Thomas Jefferson talking about Plato. And he's talking about the whimsies, the unintelligible jargon of the work. And he said, often I laid it down and I said to myself, how could the world believe for so long that this stuff is that this nonsense is worth reading? How could the Christian world indeed have done it? It's a piece of what Jefferson calls, it's a piece of historical curiosity. I can't figure out how Plato became so popular. Then he goes on, how could the Roman good sense do it? If the Christians did it, how could the Romans do it too? And particularly, how could Cicero bestow such eulogies on Plato? Cicero said all of these very positive, glowing things about the brilliance of Plato. And here's Thomas Jefferson saying, how the hell could Cicero do that? I know Cicero. Cicero's a sharp guy. How could he fall for this? Is what Jefferson is saying. Although Cicero did not wield the dense logic of Demosthenes, yet he was able, learned, laborious, practiced in the business of the world, and honest. He could not be the dupe of mere style, of which he was himself the first master in the world. In other words, Cicero was too bright to fall for this, to fall for Plato's style. Then he gets into the moderns. And Jefferson says, with the moderns, I think, it is rather a matter of fashion and authority. Education is chiefly in the hands of persons who, from their profession, have an interest in the reputation and the dreams of Plato. They give the tone while at school, and few in their after years have occasion to ever revise their college opinions. But fashion and authority apart, and bringing Plato to the test of reason, take from him his sophisms, his futilities, and his incomprehensibilities. And what remains? What Jefferson is saying is, in the modern world, it's those people who are primarily interested in fashion, in impressing others, who have made Plato what he is. They want the world to believe that they read Plato, because the world has bought into the reputation that if you read Plato, you must really be sharp. And Jefferson said, Plato has style, but damn little else, is what Jefferson is saying. Now, again, this is only opinion. We're not destroying the reputation of Plato here on today's edition of the Virtual Center. I don't mean that. But here's one guy that we would never expect to say these things, saying that if you take away Plato's sophisms, his futilities, and his incomprehensibilities, if you take away the stuff that doesn't make sense, for example, what's left? In truth, Jefferson says, he is one of the race of genuine sophists who escaped the oblivion of his brethren, first by the elegance of his diction, but chiefly by the adoption and incorporation of his whimsies into the body of artificial Christianity. Basically, what he's saying is people who wanted to impress the world with how educated they are have made Plato's reputation, because they keep him alive because it's fashionable to do that. And, you know, we talked a few minutes ago about people leaving copies of journals and magazines. And, you know, I don't know how many people whose homes I've been in, there's a copy of the Wall Street Journal laying around. And you say, geez, if they read the Wall Street Journal, they must be involved in the stock market. They must be really up on the international business world. These are pretty impressive, sharp people. These are among our community leaders. And that's exactly the impression they want to give their guests. They want their guests to take from the visit. Jefferson is saying that's what's made Plato's reputation. Because as he said, if you take away the incomprehensibilities and all the stuff in Plato, what's left? He's not really saying much, but he says it so well. His diction, his style is impressive as hell, Jefferson is saying. It's all cover. He said, he refers to Plato's foggy mind. He said his foggy mind is forever presenting the semblances of objects, which, half seen through a mist, can be defined neither in form nor dimension. Yet this which should have consigned him to early oblivion really procured him immortality of fame and reverence. The things that should have driven him off the charts actually endeared him to people who wanted to impress other people. Those that we would call today society's phonies. In the letter we looked at yesterday, which was another letter from Jefferson to Adams, Jefferson talked about the artificial aristocracy, or the tinsel aristocracy. These are the very people, Jefferson said, who are responsible for making Plato what Plato is in today's world. If you focus on the substance of what Plato wrote, Jefferson is saying, he'd have been gone a long time ago. Can you believe this? I just couldn't believe it. Now he's talking about who does this. Who is it that has kept Plato from disappearing from our world, from the world's appreciation? Jefferson talks about the Christian priesthood, the scholars of the Christian church who have been focused on the wisdom and the sources, the scribes, if you will, of the ages. The Christian priesthood, finding the doctrines of Christ level to every understanding and too plain to need explanation, saw in the mysticisms of Plato materials with which they might build up an artificial system which might, from its indistinctness, admit everlasting controversy, give employment to their order, and introduce it to profit, power, and preeminence. The Christian clergy, Jefferson is saying, adopted Plato as their own because, he says, Jesus Christ was so clear on what he said that there really wasn't much need for the Christian scholars to deal with Jesus, because everybody could understand what Jesus was saying. He said it in plain, down-to-earth terms. So what they did in order to build themselves up is they adopted Plato, because nobody understands what Plato's talking about, Jefferson is implying. So what they did is they went to the mysticisms of Plato and they built him up and built up an artificial system which gave employment to their order and introduced it to profit, power, and preeminence. In other words, many of these Christian orders, like the Franciscans and the Jesuits and all of those orders, because of the scholarship and the focus on Plato, established themselves, made themselves an income, and they owe it all to Plato. The doctrines which flowed from the lips of Jesus himself are within the comprehension of a child. But thousands of volumes have not yet explained the Platonisms engrafted on them. In other words, a child can understand the words that came from the lips of Jesus Christ. But thousands of volumes can't explain Plato. Jefferson says, what does that tell us? And for this obvious reason, that nonsense can never be explained. Their purposes, however, are answered. Plato is canonized, and it is now deemed as impious to question his merits as those of an apostle of Jesus. We have made so much of Plato. He's become such an institution of the educated in this world that to even question him is deemed to be disloyal and impious. He is peculiarly appealed to as an advocate of the immortality of the soul. And I've talked a lot about Plato and some of the things Plato's written about the human soul. Plato is appealed to as an advocate for the immortality of the soul. And yet, Jefferson says, I'll venture to say that there were no better arguments than his in proof of it. Not a man in the world would believe that. Were there no better arguments than his proof of it, not a man in the world would believe it. In other words, if all we knew about the soul came from Plato, nobody would know anything. The only thing that makes the soul important to know about and read about and think about is because of what others have told us, not Plato. It is fortunate for us that Platonic republicanism has not obtained the same favor as Platonic Christianity. It's fortunate that those who are interested in setting up republican government didn't depend on what's in Plato to do it, which is what the leaders of the Christian church have done. or we should now have been all living, men, women, and children, pell-mell together like beasts of the field or forest. Yet Plato's a great philosopher, said La Fontaine. But then you go on, and he says, do you find his ideas very clear? Oh, no. He is of an obscurity impenetrable. Do you not find him full of contradictions? Certainly, La Fontaine said. He is but a sophist. But then he goes on and exclaims, oh, Plato was a great philosopher. And he closes with a statement about Socrates. And Jefferson says, Socrates had reason to complain of the misrepresentations of Plato. For in truth, his dialogues are libels on Socrates. In other words, Plato's reputation is based on what he said about Socrates. And the implication Jefferson is making is, in a court of law, Socrates would sue Plato for what he said about him. And that's really the end of what Jefferson has to say about Plato. But isn't it fascinating? I would never have expected to read anything as critical of Plato coming from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. But again, it's a private exchange between him and others. He's not pulling any punches. He's saying what he thinks. He's not trying to impress anybody. He's just kind of unloading, venting, we call it today. I think it's fascinating. And I find it heartening because I don't feel nearly as deficient as I always have. But then he goes into education generally. And what I'm proposing here is that there's clearly a link between what he says about the reputation of Plato and the criticisms he has of education in his time. He said, but then he makes the comment that I shared with you earlier. Why am I laying all of this stuff on you? He said, why am I dosing you with these antediluvian topics? And then he says, because I'm glad to have someone to whom they're familiar and who will not receive them as if they dropped from the moon. Now he starts going into the education of our young people after the revolution, after independence. He said, our post-revolutionary youth are born under happier stars than you and I were. Think about this. How many times have you heard senior citizens, older folks, talking about the younger generation and saying they don't know what work is? And the stories about how we walk to class, they go on a bus. We walk to school and we walk through snow 3 feet deep both ways to get to school. We never missed school. We never canceled because of a snowstorm. We were expected to be there and we were there. We hear this is a feature of getting old. And here's Thomas Jefferson showing exactly that. He said these kids of the post-revolutionary generation are born under happier stars than you and I were. They acquire all learning in their mother's womb and bring it into the world ready-made. The information of books is no longer necessary. And in all knowledge, which is not innate, is in contempt or neglect at least. What he's saying is these kids won't read. These kids don't believe that they can learn anything from history, from the past. They believe that everything you need to know you're born with. Every folly must run its round, he says, and so, I suppose, must that of self-learning and of self-sufficiency, of rejecting the knowledge acquired in past ages and starting on the new ground of intuition. When sobered by experience, I hope our successors will turn their attention to the advantages of education. What Jefferson is saying is, these people believe that everything you need to know you're born with. Schools have nothing to teach us. Books have nothing to teach us. Those who lived before us have nothing to teach us. Sound familiar? It did to me. I believe that what we're seeing in Jefferson is exactly what we hear today from people who are trying to rationalize their own ignorance. And Jefferson is saying, I hope our successors, I hope those who come after us can make the case for the advantages of education. And this is the part that led me to this letter, because this is what Jefferson is saying about education. I mean of education on a broad scale, and not that of the petty academies, as they call themselves, which are starting up in every neighborhood, and where one of two men possessing Latin and sometimes Greek, a knowledge of the globes, and the first 6 books of Euclid, imagine and communicate this as the sum of science. I would say that sentence is one of the most profound sentences I've ever read in Jefferson. Jefferson is the hero of education. What he's doing here is criticizing those people who have no standards. Those people who pretend that a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Greek, a little bit of knowledge about math, about Euclid, is all that you need to claim that you are educated. That's all there is to what science is about. That's all there is that we need to know about the world we live in. He said they commit their pupils to the theater of the world with just taste enough of learning to be alienated from industrious pursuits, and not enough to do service in the ranks of science. These people are not educators, they are pretend educators. They are phonies. They are people who give students just a little bit of learning, just enough to convince them that they don't have to work for a living because they're educated. But the fact of the matter is they don't know enough to contribute anything to the ranks of science. In other words, they're kind of in Never Never Land. What education they have is pretend education. It's artificial. It's superficial. There's no depth to it. There's no substance to it. There's no way you can use it and apply it to the challenging situations that life presents us with because you don't know enough. You don't go deeply enough. He said, we have some exceptions indeed. I presented one to you lately, and we have others. But the terms I use are general truths. I hope the necessity will at length be seen of establishing institutions here as in Europe, where every branch of science useful at this day may be taught in its highest degrees. Have you ever turned your thoughts to the plan of such an institution? I mean to a specification of the particular sciences of real use in human affairs. It's 1814. Jefferson is already thinking about the curriculum for the University of Virginia that he's going to create. Jefferson believes that if this nation is really going to make it, then we have got to educate our leaders, really educate them, so that they really know some stuff. This artificial, phony, superficial education that we're giving in these petty academies that are springing up everywhere, Jefferson said, this is a joke. What we really need are institutions where the people who attend them are really going to be challenged, We're talking about substance. We're talking about standards. We're talking about the core, the core curriculum, which here in West Virginia we just voted to get rid of because they were too hard. That's part of the reason. Think about this. Think about the issues of educational reform in today's world. Think about the phony education. He says it with Plato. He's talking about those people that pretend they read Plato. They drop quotes from Plato all over the place to try to impress people with how educated they are. But the fact of the matter is, when you really get into Plato, he says, there's really not enough there that's useful to mean anything. It's all rhetoric and style. It's all cover. It's fluff. Now that's his opinion. Believe me, I don't believe that Plato's anything but fluff. But I think you really have to work Plato, and I think that's what Jefferson is talking about. If you're going to get out of Plato what's in there, you really got to work him and work him hard. But what he's talking about is a younger generation that doesn't do it, a younger generation that won't do it, a younger generation who believes that everything they need to know they're born with. I don't need learning. I don't need books. I don't need school. I don't need the past. I don't have anything to learn from the experiences of those who lived before me, Jefferson is saying. He said, oh, there are exceptions. But the fact of the matter is, what we need in this country, he says, are institutions where every branch of science useful at this day may be taught in its highest degrees. No pulling of punches. No phony baloney stuff. No pretend education. I think with less than 10 minutes to go, we've got about 6-7 minutes to go in our program. I think you kind of might have an idea as to where I'm going to go for a conclusion on this. Think about education in today's world. Think about the education of the masses. Think about what Jefferson infers as pretend education. Think about the people who claim they're really educated, but they really skated through. Think about the people who are walking around with college degrees that never wrote anything in their lives. Think about the number of people who are in college, who have graduated from college, who in the privacy of their own closet, to use Madison's term, would acknowledge that they never read a book from one end to the other. Think of the number of people who have gone through college by adding and dropping classes based on whether they require writing or not. The numbers of people whose entire college curriculum is based on classes which have nothing but multiple choice and true-false exams. Think about people who get their entire degrees at home on the internet, who claim that they're getting an education. They're getting a degree, they're getting the credential, but there's nothing to it. There's no substance. And the nation is falling further and further and further behind the rest of the world. We are improving our graduation rates, which is a goal of our education institutions. More people are graduating with credentials that signify less and less. That's my feeling. I believe we need rigor. Education is work. Learning is work. Hard work. You don't cancel school because the weather turns bad. If you have something like the internet, then you have a plan B in place always. If we can't physically get to school, then the learning will come to you via the internet. But you do not get a day off or a week off or a summer off. Learning is and must be lifelong. Constantly, we must be learning things well enough to be able to apply them so that we can begin to learn new things. The research tells us that true learning is based on what we already know, being able to use what we already know in order to learn more. Therefore, learning never stops. And what we have got to do is educate people well enough that they are able to substantively move forward to become self-learners. And this artificial jargon about taking a course in this and a class in that, so you can put on your transcript that you took a course in it, you may not know anything about it. The fact that you got an A in it doesn't mean anything if you become proficient at taking multiple choice tests and fill in the blank tests and true or false tests and all the rest of it. It's if you've never had a paper, you've never had to do a research project, you never had to work with a group of others in order to put together a report written by several people who are doing independent research, coming together, and you have to take all of that research and synthesize it, pull it together so that it says something meaningful. That's what we're talking about. That's the level of education we have to have in this country. I mentioned 2 hours ago at the very beginning of today's program what I was looking for and why I was so particularly interested in education at this point. We've only got about 2 minutes to go before we have to close our program. Last evening, I went on the website of Jim Justice, who's the Democratic candidate for governor of West Virginia. And the reason I did that is because Jim Justice, in one of the campaign speeches that I heard him make, talked about education in West Virginia and how we really had to turn education around, that our kids were falling too far behind everybody else. And what Jim Justice said is that he wants to make education, not just approach education by making up the deficiencies in order that our kids can catch up with others. He wants to make education an economic engine in West Virginia. Make education so good and so high quality that the best teachers in the country will want to come here to teach. He believes that turning West Virginia's economy around is in part connected to the quality of education he has. I believe him. I accept that. I support that. In fact, I'm running for the House of Delegates with that kind of thing in mind. My feeling is then that my next challenge in writing is going to be to put together a political piece on education, on how Jim Justice can actually do that, what is necessary. So I've started to do the research, and I've already done a lot of it, obviously. But I started to do the research on what I would say in a paper which would support candidate Justice and say he's talking about making education an economic engine in West Virginia's economy. I want to show you how we can do that. And so it's in looking up that I went to Jefferson's Ideas on Education, and that's where I picked up this copy of this Jefferson letter to John Adams, dated July 5th, 1814, because in it, Jefferson talked about education and the superficial nature of education in his day. And oh, there's so much more in this letter. I hope that in the last minutes and couple of hours together that I was able to convince you of that. This is to me just thrilling, exciting stuff. I hope you agree. I hope that I was able to make that point clear to you. We're at the end of our day. We're at the end of our broadcast week. It's 1 minute before the top of the hour. It's 59 minutes after the hour, 2 o'clock in the east, so we're at 2:59. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank you for tuning in each day. I hope that you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful rest of the week in July, in mid-July, and I hope that you'll be able to come back and join us again next week here at the Virtual Center. If you run into friends that you believe might enjoy these programs, I really encourage you to get them to tune in as well. This is Bill O'Brien, thanking you so very, very much. Please be kind to each other. Be good to those you love. Enjoy and appreciate those you love, because you don't always have them. Thank you so very much. I appreciate you all. Thank you.